Hello, everyone. Before starting, I'd just like to thank the Heritage Education Network for hosting this symposium and for allowing me to present my research. I want to begin by drawing your attention to a home on the south side of Belize City that sits between South Street and Berkeley Street along Wagner's Lane. It is a home that, at first glance, may appear unassuming. The unadorned wooden paneling of its walls, where it has not yet rotted away entirely, has, in the absence of paint, instead been covered by a thin layer of mildew. The zinc that galvanizes its roof, hardly visible anymore, has been overcome by a carmine coating of rust that has brittled the slanting sheets of corrugated iron which lay beneath. The slender stilts that buttress its overhanging facade have grown strained by the weight that they support, continuing to bear the load only just barely. Yet, far from solely indicating decay, the worn and weathered exterior of this home also acts as an enduring reminder of its longevity. Moreover, so too do a variety of its architectural features. The single hung glass windows covered by wooden louvers, the ornate brackets that decorate the top corners of the balcony, and the jalousie shutter that lies at the center of the gable roof, all hallmarks of colonial period architecture in Belize, situate the origins of the home in the distant past. I bring these visibly time-honored features to the fore not only to demonstrate the historical standing of the home on Wagner's Lane that they feature on, but also to broach the significance of the home's situation within the Belize City community of Eboe Town, which is located in the southeastern sector of Belize City's historical core. The community is specifically situated in the area that lies between Dean Street in the north, Racecourse Street in the south, Albert Street in the east, and the Canal Streets in the west. Often overlooked or given only limited coverage in previous histories of Belize, Eboe Town emerged at latest in the second half of the 18th century as one of the incipient permanent Afro-Belizean communities in the fledgling settlement. It served as a home first for enslaved Africans in the 18th and early 19th centuries, and then for free Black laborers following emancipation in 1838 and onwards. The unequivocally African identity of the community is signaled by its namesake, the word Eboe, spelled I-G-B-O, which, despite its spelling, is pronounced in the same way as the anglicized rendering of the word included in the name of the community as E-B-O-E. The Eboe are a West African ethnic group, some of the members of which were among those who arrived in Belize as part of the transatlantic slave trade and, according to primary sources, upheld and engaged with their ethnic identity even while enslaved in the settlement. The virtual absence of discussion about Eboe Town from historical scholarship is mirrored in, and indeed can mostly be attributed to, its near invisibility in primary sources from the colonial period. Other than a map from the 1829 edition of the Honduras Almanac, which shows the situation of the community to be in precisely the area I outlined, one of the only other explicit references to Eboe Town in a primary source comes from an account of Belize City by Baptist missionary Frederick Crowe, published in 1850 based on his travels to the settlement during the 2 decades prior. Crowe's account is remarkable not merely for its allusion to Eboe Town, but also because it provides, as far as I am aware, the only textual testimony of the homes and layout of the community during the 19th century. His account reads, "Further back from the shore is Eboe Town, consisting of numerous yards flanked with long rows of what are called houses, being simply separate rooms under one long roof, which used to be appropriated to slaves and now accommodate the poorer laborers." In spite of its brevity, Crowe's account offers unparalleled insight into the social and physical composition of Eboe Town. Of particular relevance to the discussion that I have supplied so far, his portrayal of the houses in the community as being composed of simply separate rooms under one long roof almost perfectly describes the distinctly rectangular form of the home on Wagner's Lane. To be sure, it is highly unlikely that this home was among the structures that Crowe observed in Eboe Town in the 19th century during his stint in Belize, especially considering events like the fire of 1863, which burnt through much of Southside Belize City. However, the unmistakable correspondence between, on one hand, his portrayal of homes in the community as being arranged in a linear manner under a single long roof, and, on the other hand, the clearly rectangular form of the home on Wagner's Lane, brings into question whether the parallel could really be mere coincidence. The glaring repetition of the rectangular form in homes throughout the rest of Eboe Town seems to indicate that it is anything but. In a survey of the community that I conducted, I pinpointed a total of 28 structures with rectangular forms. Many of these possess colonial period architectural elements like the home on Wagner's Lane, suggesting that the oldest remaining structures in the community retained the linear form that Crow described, whether by preserving since their original construction, or more likely, by undergoing reconstruction and/or modification at some point in the colonial past. Adding to the intrigue, this preponderance of structures with rectangular forms in Eboe Town is highly irregular when compared to colonial period architecture elsewhere in Belize City. While no comprehensive typology has been developed, historians and enthusiasts alike have most frequently ascribed the design of colonial period homes in the city to the nebulous Belizean Victorian style. The characteristics of the style have never been clearly outlined, but its key components seem to consist of several of the colonial period architectural elements that I enumerated earlier. Notably though, prominent examples of the style differ starkly in appearance and especially form from the homes of Eboe Town, with one of the largest subsets of homes belonging to the style even possessing contrastingly square forms. There is, however, as was noted in the reports from a survey conducted under the auspices of the IDB in 2011, a significant degree of architectural diversity among the almost 1,000 historical structures that were identified in Belize City, far more than could ever be classified according to a single monolithic style. Nevertheless, based on my observations, even among the structures that deviate most starkly from the architectural norms of the city, hardly any display the distinct rectangular form of the homes in Eboe Town. Thus, the relative isolation of homes with novel rectangular forms to Eboe Town has led me to characterize them as a distinct house type, which I refer to as the longhouse. Given the prolonged confinement of longhouses to Eboe Town, it seems almost certain that the house type would have harbored deeply rooted social significance and cultural meaning for the earliest Afro-Belizean inhabitants of the community who likely initiated the practice of constructing and residing in them. Precisely deciphering these saliences in the absence of explicit textual testimony from those incipient inhabitants themselves is near impossible. However, comparison of the longhouses of Eboe Town with another house type prevalent across the circum-Caribbean region, known as the shotgun house, which bears unmistakable formal and historical resemblances, can potentially shed light on this lacuna in the historical record. The shotgun house is most widely renowned for its prominence within the historical built environment of New Orleans, Louisiana, where it first appeared during the 19th century before proliferating across the US Gulf Coast and Caribbean. Its history prior to emerging as a fully fledged house type, though, is convoluted, spanning vast swaths of time and space. The most credible and widely agreed upon history traces the genesis of the shotgun house to the French colony of Saint-Domingue, now known as Haiti, during the 18th century. According to this history, people of African descent in the colony, including those who were enslaved, but especially those who were marooned, developed a house type called the TK, which was characterized by its linear rectangular form. The selection of this form by Africans in Haiti, far from a coincidence, was realized through their native knowledge of West African architectural conventions, particularly among the Yoruba, whose most basic house type also possessed a rectangular form. Their partiality towards recreating this specific house type was substantiated by the architectural practices of the indigenous Taino, who built similarly rectangular structures called bohio. Subsequent to the development of the TK, at the tail end of the 18th century, in the wake of the Haitian Revolution, migrants, particularly Maroons fleeing the conflict, made their way to Louisiana. Once relocated there, they continued the practice of living in and constructing TK-like structures, first in the rural areas where they initially resided, then, by the early 19th century, as they further integrated into society, in New Orleans, where the house type evolved to take on the architectural character of the city, thereby becoming the fully realized shotgun house that we see today. This history establishes the shotgun house at its core as an African diasporic architectural invention born out of a West African cultural survival. Applying this to the Belizean context, beckons consideration of whether the longhouses of Eboe Town, given their very obvious formal and historical parallels with the shotgun house, are also the result of continuity in West African cultural practices pertaining to architecture. The isolation of longhouses in Belize City to the historical Afro-Belizean community of Eboe Town certainly lends credence to this prospect in implying that only people of African descent in the settlement held cultural backgrounds predisposing them to the practice of constructing and living in houses with rectangular forms. Conversely, the well-documented arrival of the vast majority of enslaved Africans in Belize by way of other territories in the Americas, rather than directly from Africa, suggests that if longhouses did arise out of continuity with West African cultural traditions, they likely would have taken hold first among Africans in an intermediary destination, like Haiti, for example, prior to arriving in Belize. While African influence on colonial period architecture is not explicitly attested in written accounts of Eboe Town, it is recorded in an account of a logging camp in Belize from 1790 by British traveler Thomas Graham, in which he noted that in the arranging and appearance of the habitations, much rural taste is often displayed, and it is highly gratifying to the curious to remark the different modes peculiar to the several nations or tribes of Africa. Reading past the patently racist provincial connotations that pervade his account, Graham's attribution of elements of the built environment to African sources is significant for establishing a late 18th century precedent for West African cultural continuities in architecture in Belize. This corroborates the already presented evidence for the occurrence of the same phenomenon in Eboe Town by the early 19th century. Furthermore, in alluding not only to the appearance, but also the arranging of habitations in the logging camp, his account introduces the notion that the positioning of structures within the community, in addition to their design, was reflective of West African cultural traditions. This observation may help illuminate the significance of yet another peculiarity observable within present-day Eboe Town, which I have yet to address until this point. That is, its unorthodox spatial configuration. Viewed from above, Eboe Town can be seen to comprise 3 blocks. Notably, these 3 blocks stand out from the surrounding historical core of the city due to their unusually large and secluded interiors. More specifically, each of these blocks, but especially the central and southern ones, feature spacious internal areas that, for the most part, are not intersected by nor directly accessible from the surrounding streets and are instead filled by a scattering of structures and verdant vegetation. Contrastingly, blocks in adjacent historical areas of the city are intersected by streets at far more regular intervals to accommodate traffic, as well as access to individual yard lots, and also feature noticeably less greenery. Here yet again, Crow's account seemingly corroborates the historical standing of the features of the community visible today. In this instance, his allusion to the presence of numerous yards indicates that open space rather than densely packed housing was abundant. Meanwhile, his portrayal of those yards as being flanked with long rows of houses suggests that the structures in the community encircled open areas furnished by the yards. As noted earlier, the landscape of Eboe Town has no doubt shifted since Crow recorded his account, but the open yard area surrounded by houses that he observed evidently prevail into the present day. While I am currently not familiar with any specific West African analogs for this mode of spatial configuration, its novelty within the historical landscape of Belize City is reason enough to further probe its possible African roots in future research. For now, though, the evidence that I have presented provides a clear enough picture for me to offer some interpretations. I propose that the distinct structures and spatial configuration of Eboe Town, which arose among its incipient and exclusively Afro-descendant population, set the community apart from the rest of Belize City, establishing it as a critical site for both the preservation of pre-existing West African cultural traditions and the emergence of a new Creole cultural identity. To illustrate this point, I present an account from the 1830 edition of the Honduras Almanac, which documents some of the festivities held by enslaved Africans in Belize City. It reads, being importations from the coast of Africa, large parties meet at night at some appointed yard where they commence the dancing to the beat of the drum and the music of their voices. It is highly plausible, probable even, that the yards of Eboe Town were the venues that hosted these gatherings of enslaved Africans in Belize City. Thus, not only was the physical makeup of the community, in terms of its architecture and spatial configuration, likely reflective of West African cultural traditions, so too were the practices that were engaged in within by the Afro-Belizean residents. Furthermore, even though this account was written from the perspective of a member of the settler class, the seclusion afforded by the large blocks of Eboe Town, as well as the yards flanked by houses within them, may have provided inhabitants partaking in activities like the gatherings described, with a layer of concealment against constant surveillance or observation by the settler class. Moreover, I also contend that the community is an untapped archive of the life histories of some of the most frequently overlooked figures in the Belizean past, Afro-descendant Black women. This much is indicated in the musings of some prominent scholars who have reckoned with deciphering the contributions of women to the formation of Belizean society. For instance, Asad Shoman astutely inferred that Black women were the heads of households in Belize City during the logging season. He conjectures that men were in the logging camps for months at a time, while women and children stayed in Belize Town. The result was that the majority of households were, for most of the year, led by women. It fell to women to raise and care for their children and to socialize them. They were largely responsible for instilling in them a sense of pride and resistance to bondage, and for creating and transferring cultural values. Shoman's formulation of family life in Belize City suggests that women would have been at the forefront of households in Eboe Town, playing a critical role in the socialization of children in the community, including the transmission of West African cultural practices. Meanwhile, in analyzing the modes of political resistance taken up by Black women in Belize in the 19th century, Anne McPherson emphasized the urgent need for further inquiry into where and among whom these practices of resistance took root. She asserts, to challenge and refine these hypotheses, we desperately need to know much more about family, neighborhood, and class formation in the process of creolization. Did the formation of areas like Overpond provide the urban space in which such networks could consolidate? While McPherson speculated whether Overpond, a community which was in the area that now constitutes Mesopotamia, furnished Black women with the critical autonomous urban space in which to engage in political discourse and strategization, I suspect that it was in fact Eboe Town, based on the evidence and interpretations that I have presented, that would have served in precisely this capacity. Finally then, I would like to conclude by returning to the home that I began by discussing. I contend that this home is the foremost embodiment of the novel qualities and African spirit of Eboe Town. Thinking with and through this home forces us to reassess and reimagine histories of Belize that conceive of our African ancestors only in terms of their entanglement within the timber extraction industry. Its long-standing and continued presence demands that we conjured the forgotten lived experiences, not only of the majority who labored sojourned in remote logging camps for extended periods of the year, but also the minority who endured British hegemony away from the primary theater of the colonial economy. On the home front, Eboe Town. On that note, I will end by once again thanking the Heritage Education Network for hosting this event and allowing me to present, and I look forward to any feedback that viewers may have.